Bu iki bölümünde ikinci konuşmacımız Sayın Doktor Radhika Santhanam Martin. Doktor Martin konuşmanın öğleden sonraki bu bölümünde önce kendisiyle ilgili birkaç şey söylemek isterim. Kendisi klinik psikolog. Ağırlıklı olarak travma üzerine çalışmalarıyla biliniyor. Aynı zamanda narratif psikoloji konusunda da uzman. Mehmet Bey'den öğrendiğime göre kendisi 6-7 dil biliyor. As far as I learned from Mehmet, you know 6 or 7 languages.
Yes, I do.
Including Turkish. Unfortunately. Türkçeyi de biliyor mu diye çok az bir şey bildiğini söyledi. Konuşmasını tabii ki İngilizce yapacak. Şimdi hazırlıkları tamamlanıyor sanıyorum.
Tonight.
Oh, really?
I was told yesterday that most of Turkey uses günaydın, but tünaydın is very rare, and only primary school children speak tünaydın. So, for the non-Turkish, good afternoon. I have to say, I so enjoyed Jaswant's presentation, and you know, we don't have the flexibility. I could have easily given my time to her and listened. The thing I wanted to talk about trauma, brain, and attachment, and I've been thinking about what angle, because a lot of you know a lot about trauma, brain, and attachment, like everybody else in the world who work in this area. So I was trying to think, what angle should I take? And I was hoping I could use Mullah Nasruddin and his donkey to give me an inspiration. And I don't know for how long I would have searched. I searched for a long time. He hasn't done anything, not the donkey, on attachment. So for the non-Turkish, Mullah Nasruddin is very much like Mr. Curly and his duck. So it's really hard for me, because I want to talk about, I've been in the field now from 1988. I clinically trained, finished my training. And the three areas that I've been working, which is trauma, brain, and attachment, every single decade it has changed the concepts. The field has changed so much, and still changing. So the goalposts are constantly moving, including what, you know, if you heard what Malcolm said, what Jaswant said, the way we use categories, the way we use the language, particularly the way we understand the brain, has so rapidly shifted. So today I'm going to talk about the challenges I have had as a practitioner from 1988 to 2015 to catch up with the changing goalposts of the field in these three areas. So the thing I'm going to do is how new information actually fundamentally changes the way we practice. Because Jaswant mentioned epigenetics. We mirror neurons. We had no idea. In 1988, nobody taught me mirror neurons. And for that matter, even attachment. There was very little work, apart from theoretical work, as to how to apply it in a therapeutic setting was unknown. So but then now in 2015, that's pretty much my bread and butter. I do so much of attachment therapeutic intervention. So I'm going to invite you into this journey of how fundamentally concepts change. So it's not about whether we change the society, to the question he asked. It's more about how we change. Practitioners change, and practitioners change because of the reflections we are having on our own practice. So that's what, and it's some of the learnings. Of course, there are many, many learnings, and I can't take you through all of them. So I'm just going to highlight some of the key ones. So one of the first ones that's changed for me was, so I'm going to divide it into trauma, brain, and attachment, and let's see how the wedding goes in the end. So when I was first taught about trauma, there was no concept about a spectrum of trauma. And that is a huge change in terms of how we use language, how we use our interventions, what kind of promotion and early intervention would we do for a spectrum of trauma. So we are already bringing in severity and what Jaswant called about resilience and things like that. I'm just wondering whether I should, I've got quite a few slides, so I'm going to keep going, so I'm not going to read everything that you're looking at. So if you look at some of the key fundamental papers that changed trauma understanding for us, for example, Lenotre wrote about type 1 and type 2. That was only in 1991. So prior to that, there is a lot of things we wrote about trauma. And I do want to talk about some of the type 1, type 2, but also my own concept of trauma. So like Malcolm, I worked in with the veterans, and PTSD was the language every day, day in and day out. And that was my first job actually in Australia, the Concord Veterans Hospital. And you know, we did some really, we really tried hard. And one of the things, quite accidentally, what happened at that time for me was I was asked to do locum in a burns unit in that very same hospital. So I was working as a psychologist for war veterans, and then I was asked to do, as part of my job, also cover the burns unit. Burns also called it trauma. And for me, one of the key learnings came from working in the burns unit with the burns clients. And what was the key learning? The key learning was that the skin heals very differently to memories. It was one of the transformative moments for me to understand that the healing of skin is so different, and the way we speak about it, because I used to see 80-degree burnt people completely devastated and shattered, and after seeing them for 3 years, the skin just recovers and heals. And it was so different with memories. So that was a key learning in terms of seeing trauma and the way trauma was talked about, and the engagement and relationship with trauma that I was having in these two different groups. Because one group, they could never, it was very hard, it wasn't like the skin. Anyway, the second major thing that changed my learning was the information from the studies between 95 and 97, which a lot of us Jaswant has already covered, and it was done what is now called adverse childhood experiences and what it does to you. And there is a lot of things growing up prior to 18 in a household with, and there are a whole range of things that happens which kind of is the foundation. So the trauma hasn't yet happened, But that is the environment, and I'll come to that, what it does to the brain. So, spectrum of trauma, trauma types and the degrees and the way skin and memories interact, and the impact of trauma, a lot of it at that time was written around the developmental level of the person or where the stressor will be. So by now, around late 90s, we were coming to speak a language of complex trauma, developmental trauma, ongoing trauma, intergenerational trauma. There was all of these things absolutely coming at us. But at that time, there was also one of the key things that I was struggling with in my therapeutic work was what Kamal raised as a question, because what I was struggling with was the way the narratives of meaning and memory was coming, and the way socio-politically people were situating their trauma, and the way cultural context played into the stories or the narratives of trauma. So this was becoming a big therapeutic conversation, which had, in terms of actually how we negotiate meaning and how we negotiate suffering, is not a big part of classification systems. So that was coming up in conversations. So that was the other key struggle that came up in terms of trauma. Now I'll go to brain. So pre-1988, my first degree was neuropsychology. So I learned a lot about brain, and I'm fascinated by it even now. More because we understand less and less. So, one of the things that I was constantly taught was that about, of course, brain structures, brainstem, midbrain, limbic system, cortex. But a lot of the studies came from split brain at that time. And, you know, there was such excitement around split brain studies, and I remember my neuropsychological teachers getting very fascinated about split brain studies. And lo and behold, I'm going to show you, because nowadays there is very little, nobody will talk about split brain, because we are convinced and we are clear that the brain works as a whole, and it's not hemisphere difference. But I'm going to show you a book that I really like, and I'm fascinated by the author as well, I have to say. And it's called The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. And the author's name is Ian McGilchrist, and he has done a beautiful TED Talk if you want to watch. But I'm just going to show you 3 minutes of his talk, because he doesn't talk. It's an artistic representation of his ideas. So let's see whether I can work this. We have come to rely a lot on the left hemisphere and the functions of the left hemisphere, and we are slowly making the functions of right hemisphere less and less valuable for us, and this is going to cost us. I'm not going to show the whole, I'm just going to, but I'm going to show and that's why he's doing it in art and pictures, because he wants.
Popularity in the 60s and 70s after the first split brain operations, and it led to a sort of popularization.
So did you see the images before? One of the more, I guess, challenging ways for trauma interventions. So I'll keep going. Will somebody tell me if I'm going beyond time, because I don't want to go into pause time. Yeah? You know, we'll have to be a little bit patient. close it. And start it again. And just go to the So what we do know now is that we don't have a brain, we have 3 brains. We have a reptilian brain, and we have a mammalian brain, and we have a rational brain. And that we have to make sure that if we are talking about trauma or memories or any kind of behavioral encoding of behavior, we'll have to be able to do interventions at all 3 levels. So that's a huge change in the field. That wasn't how it was seen in 1988, I can tell you. And we know a lot about, in detail, how the brain responds to stress, how it responds to chaos, how it responds to neglect, and how it responds to abuse. Now, I can go into details, I've got lots there, but I'm not going to because we don't have time. We also know, we have got all these new words, and we know a lot about emotional regulation, dissociation, hyperarousal. We know a lot about how it happens, what happens in the brain, in what conditions it happens, whether it happens more with women or with men. We have lots of data pouring out. What we yet don't know, and we are struggling with, is what to do with all this information. How do we do interventions that will help people who dissociate? We do have some that we are trying, and I'll go into that in a minute, but usually we have more information about what rather than how to I guess not so much fix it, but how to repair it, or how to lessen the effects of dissociation, things like that. Because we all dissociate, eh? Most of us would in a conference like this, that's for sure. Mirror neurons and epigenetics, yep, I talked about that. The other strand that has come out in a big way is trauma and brain mediated, the key component as memory. How do we understand memory in the brain? Which, at the time that I was doing neuropsychology, there was not much of debate around memory, but now there is so much. You could do an entire conference on memory. So trauma and memory in terms of brainstem carries what kind of memory? What does the cerebellum carry? What kind of memory? What kind of memory does the limbic system carry? And what kind of memory does the cortex carry? Because a lot of the intervention is only looking at cortex. So it's really important that we understand this. One of the key things, at least in my trajectory of the career, what changed my thinking about a whole range of trauma, brain, and attachment, which I'll be talking in a minute, is this whole concept of how we came to understand theory of mind, which originally was an experiment that was only done for autism children because it's a test of empathy. I won't go into it, I'm going to show you the test in a minute. But the concept, the ability to understand about the other person, was a huge breakthrough in understanding trauma and how trauma encodes memory. It was a very simple task, and it was called Sally Ann's marbles. So I don't know how many of you have done it. I did it for a long time, day in and day out, because I did neuropsychological testing. It's a simple experiment which is done for empathy, and the reason I'm showing that is usually it's given for children so that we understand around 2 to 3 years. When they're about 2 to 3, they can start doing. By the time they are 4, most of the children will pass the test. Of course, children with autism will not, and children also, even children with Downs will pass. and children with physical disabilities will have no problem, hearing impaired children will have no problem, but autism children, because it's a test of empathy. The reason why this was important for us is because reflective capacity is really impaired in trauma. Because in traumatizing relationship, the person avoids thinking about or trying to understand the mind of the parent or the other. So this results, and now, mentalization. That's only the last 10 years, this word. Mentalization is a big thing now in understanding trauma and in thinking about trauma interventions. This wasn't even a word in when I was training. Trauma and memory, and particularly what we now have come to understand, verbal and pre-verbal memory, has become a big thing. Now, even though initially you might think pre-verbal means it's children, we are not talking about children. You could have a trauma memory as an adult without as a pre-verbal memory, because memories can be coded in, as we saw, in different parts. I will now go to attachment, and why are we talking about attachment when we are talking about trauma and brain? Because that is where most of the interventions these days have come from. In the last 10 years, certainly my entire profession has been around doing various kinds of attachment focused interventions. And it is based on the fact that chronic trauma interferes with the capacity to integrate sensory, emotional and cognitive information to do what? To establish a relationship. Because we are pinning it on this, that is, chronic trauma affects all levels to form a relationship, attachment interventions in trauma has become really important. So the core deficits in trauma and brain has been interpersonal relationships, affect regulation, and a whole range of reflective function and empathy. And the way we understand what to do about that is we start to have experiences that will re-script some of the specific neural connections, and sharing positive emotional states, or what is in attachment literature called security, secure base, security and safety are really important. There are a whole range of research things that's come around here, which is both experimental and clinical. And now you're into another big thing that's come only in the last 10 to 15 years, the polyvagal theory of Stephen Porges, which is it's really, in terms of trauma work, in the current context, that if you want to address activation, body activation, you will have to understand what Porges is saying about polyvagal theory. But the beginnings of attachment didn't start here. In pre-1988, when I was taught attachment by these people. And it was very useful, but it's very different to what we are now talking as attachment. So certainly John Bowlby and Harry Harlow, by the way, is now, we learned so much, and we were all so interested in in Harry's experiments with monkeys. But if you now look at, I don't know how many of you have followed the debate of Harry Harlow's, it's become a huge controversy in the field because he used monkeys and deprived them. So it's become unethical, and he's now called psychopath, and a whole range of things. So it's also interesting how something that was given sanction, he did it late 60s, and the results were published early 70s, is now seen as almost criminal and brutal. And that he went step by step and pushed, because he did, he called it the love experiment, and there's a huge controversy about. Anyway, so those were the things I was taught, but the things you will be taught in attachment are these people, particularly Fonagy and Cassidy and Shore and Hughes and Perry and Dan Siegel, and Circle of Security, which is one of the things I do, and I train. I'm a Circle of Security practitioner. So 40 years of attachment research is telling us that we are relational beings, and that to the degree we are connected, we feel safe, and to the degree we are not connected, we feel less safe. Now, you may say, we didn't need 40 years of research to know this, but looks like we did. Attachment behavior itself, in terms of the interventions, are these are the ones we would be seeing. In developing attachment in a relationship, because attachment behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum, so it has to be in a relationship. And why are we talking about attachment? Because that's where the trauma intervention comes. Why are we talking about trauma interventions? Because that's what happens to the brain in forming a relationship. So in the entire therapeutic intervention is, how do we build safe and secure relationships? That's the bottom line. So whether Jaswant is doing the work in building resilience of the children, the idea is, how do we help children to build relationships that are safe and that are secure, with adults too. So the core idea about attachment intervention in trauma is that it is we have to find a way, because it's a behavioral organization that promotes protection of the child, and it is developmentally organized. What do we mean by that? Not the age of the child, because security and safety is based on the experience that the brain is encoding. So if you don't have that experience that's repeated, that's real, and that's predictable, then it doesn't matter how old you are, you will not be organizing your safety in that way in the brain. So one of the concepts we call in attachment is a secure base that you can go out from and come back to. So that's the circle of security. You go out because you know you can come back to it safely. So it's both a simple and complex concept, but it's not a simplistic concept. It's a nice, profound concept. The other key thing that's come out in our language, which was never there in attachment literature, is the internal working model. Jaswant mentioned that several times in her presentation. And internal working models have become a big concept in the way we work with trauma and using attachment frameworks. In working with attachment interventions, the practitioners are clear. It's an implicit relational knowing. So how are we going to promote interventions that would help implicit relational knowing? One of the things Jaswant mentioned was the way we promote is we find somebody to build secure relationship. We need at least one figure who will unconditionally be there for you, irrespective of crises in your family. Things like that. How do we build that? So the critical concepts in attachment theory in the last 20 years has been, which is very different to pre-88 when I started. The key concepts are holding environment, which certainly Winnicott talked about. He talked beautifully about holding environment, which increasingly we are trying to understand. How does a holding environment look to do trauma work? And I'll tell you in a minute how some of the scholars are thinking about this. Attunement, meaning, are we tuned in with the feelings of the person and the environment when we are doing trauma work? Organization of affect and feelings, and then of course state of mind. I wanted to show you a lovely DVD for state of mind, but I'm not going to because it'll stuff it up again. State of mind is not what happened to you during your development, but how you currently make sense of it. So I have a child, my child is throwing a tantrum in the supermarket, and I'm looking at my child and I think, my mother told me I'll never be a good mother, she was right. Or I look at my child and I think, oh my God, everybody who is passing her is thinking, I am not capable to be a mother. Or I'm looking at my child and I'm thinking, oh my God, it's so close to lunchtime, she's going to tire herself out by crying. There are three different ways of looking at the same behavior. The child is crying, that's the same. So state of mind is a completely new internal working model that we are now figuring it out in trauma, how it affects, how do we intervene, how do we have conversations in order to manage the state of mind. So the last section is we have to marry these three, the three sections of brain, trauma and attachment, where the last 25 years it's moved completely. And now it'll be a little bit of a menage a trois, isn't it, anyway? So the four arms of trauma intervention at this moment in the literature. So by the time you do 25 years of your journey, these all may have completely changed again. Goalposts move all the time. At this moment, bringing the three together in the trauma intervention, what is being suggested is that we have to have four arms: relationships recovery, skills recovery, self-care, and reflexivity of the practitioner. Okay? I'm going to go through this very quickly. Relationships recovery, you can do several things. It doesn't matter what approach you're going to use. You have the conceptual understanding should be, am I doing relationships recovery or skills recovery or self-care or reflexivity, which I'm coming in a minute. Skills recovery can be any number of things. Problem solving. We can do a whole range of behavioral interventions and speech therapy and massage therapy for children, but it has to integrate the sensory, emotional and cognitive skills for the child. Self-care, we talk a lot about it, and I could have spent a little bit more. Anyway, reflective functioning. So this is not reflective functioning for the person, it's the reflective functioning of the practitioner. So it's basically the reflexivity is around when I'm trying to understand what this person is going through, do I also know that I bring a set of knowledge, skills, practice, beliefs, assumptions, and that gets fused with the one in front of me. Now, in the range of interventions, there are many, many, many. I have written a few only because these are things people don't try often, and there are some very interesting results that have come out. And for example, Jaswant's thing around group so parent-driven groups has been, Patricia Crittenden used to talk about it even in the early 90s, how important it is for managing trauma. But that's come up in a very big way. Body and sensory motor approaches, and the field is now called actually sensory experiencing therapies. It's the Peter Levine group and Pat Ogden and Babette Rothschild, and they are all around body remembers, and they do a whole range of body sensory motor integrated therapies. Very fine work and some very interesting research. Lots of expressive therapies, which includes art, film, drama, sand, any number of creative mediums. Relationship-based approaches, this is one of my favorite ones, and I use circle of security, I use narrative therapy, which is the next one, where a whole range of approaches are available to do remembering, reauthoring, externalizing, tree of life, team of life approaches. So are we there, Ed? I mean, have we now closed the gaps of these three, and can I now feel like, oh, now I know? Actually, no. So the new one that's coming out, where we know very little, is in evolutionary biology. Particularly people like Sarah Blair-Farhadi. She's written a fantastic book called Mothers and Others. And her argument is that we, as human beings, we have evolved as cooperative breeders. We can never do this alone. This dyadic thing that we have got is a misnomer. So her thing is there are so many mothers and there are so many alloparents, meaning the community, and we are not looking at that. So it's a big sentence here, but I just want you to know that this is the evolutionary biologist telling us. No study takes into account the possibility that humans evolved as cooperative breeders and that a caregiver's responsiveness also happens to be a good indicator of her social supports. In terms of developmental outcomes, the most relevant factor might not be how securely or insecurely attached to the mother the baby is, but rather how secure the baby is in relation to all the people in the environment. So, to make it simple, what Sarah is trying to say, and please, if you can, listen to her Tana lectures of 2010, I think, and it explains it. I've just cut and paste the last one. What she's trying to say is that you have to do a web of attachment, not one attachment. So think of it as a network. If you do a network of attachment, even if there is one that's weak or fragile, it can hold. But if you do only dyadic attachment, then you're putting a lot of pressure, and that's not how human beings evolved. Forget collective societies and others. She's actually talking about 157 tribal groups that she studied. So, and Jude Cassidy, one of the attachment gurus, also says clearly in her book, and that's only 2010, I think, we need a radical change from a dyadic perspective to an attachment network approach. In Western and non-Western cultures, most children, but also most adults, communicate with several attachment figures. So we have to think beyond the individual for attachment, trauma, and the brain. We have to look at the family, we have to look at the community and society. And Helen Herman talked about Michael Marmot and Wilkinson, and one of my favorite researchers, because they have put on the map the whole thing around social and political determinants of health. Their book, The Spirit Level, is a very powerful account of how we'll never be able to address trauma if we don't take structural factors into consideration, which was one of Jaswant's point about should practitioners get involved. So they talk about the caregiving is part of community. So poverty and low socio cohesion, all of this is important. They also talk about larger social conflicts like war, displacement, torture. And I want to finish with, so in Australia there is a scholar who is from the trauma field, and she is an Indigenous Australian. Her name is Judy Atkinson. As far as I know, she is the first one who started writing about trauma-informed service is very different to trauma-focused care. So she was the first one who is highlighting now to say trauma-informed service means you will have to have many things in the service that promotes the understanding, which is very different to trauma-focused care, which is only for the clinicians and the therapists and the workers and whoever does the work. But trauma-informed service is a much larger responsibility, which includes cultural competence, safety, understanding recovery is possible, to use John's words, share power and governance, integrate care, build relationships, and collaborate with community. Now, if you ask me whether there are things that we still struggle with and we don't know, I think we are struggling a lot with a few things in the trauma field, and some of which I'm hoping POSE work will enlighten us. How to work with shame is a big thing in trauma field, and that's an area we are struggling. How to work with humiliation, and how to work with rage, and how to work with trauma that's not post-trauma, that's ongoing trauma, which is post-topic. The very last one I want to say, for me, the biggest struggle is we work in silos. We don't do research with evolutionary biologists and drummers and artists and filmmakers. We are lonely workers, and all the fields are lonely workplaces. Collaboration is so minimal, and one of the things Judy Atkinson writes about how collaboration should happen, she talks about it should be dense, and it should be frequent communication, and it should be tactical information sharing, and power should be shared between. I truly hope we can, because I personally think, as Jaswant said, trauma is a human condition. Each of us struggle in ways far beyond the comprehension of many who know us. We are hardwired for relationships, and there are macro and micro traumas that we experience, that we inflict, and we are exposed to. And bearing witness for suffering and healing matters to all of us. Thank you.
Kurduğumuz yakın ilişkiler bir biçimde travmatik durumlara maruz bırakıyorsa bizi, ki bu konuda yapılan çok çalışmalar var, o zaman ne olur konusunda çok aydınlatıcı bilgiler verdi. Sanıyorum soru almak için biraz vaktimiz var. 2 soru alabiliriz diyor Mehmet Bey de. Sorry. Ha. Okay. Ha. Çeviriyle ilgili problem var mı diye. 2 soru alabiliriz. Salondan sorular varsa.
Tamam, ben başlıyorum şimdi.
Can Hocam sorusunu soracak.
Şimdi Radhika'nın ilgilendiği konu olarak bir de intersectionality var. Radhika farkında. Bir de mentalization dediğimiz. Şimdi konuyu daha da böyle bir ayrıntılı hale getirmek ya da tartışmayı daha geniş bir platforma çekmek için attachment'la, bağlanmayla, bu intersectionality ve bir de mentalizasyon ya da mentalization'ı bir araya aldığımız vakit bu kontekstlerde, yani bu kavramda, bu bağlamlarda nasıl bir değerlendirme yapabiliriz? Çünkü attachment'ta Radhika'nın dediği gibi dayadık ikili taraftan çok yönlü tarafa geçiş var. O zaman intersectionality, tekrar ediyoruz, intersectionality ve mentalization bir araya getirirsek nasıl bir değerlendirme yapabiliriz? İstersen İngilizce'de sorabilirim.
Mümkünse Can Hocam, İngilizce'de belki bir problem oldu çünkü çeviride sanıyorum.
Peki.
Okay.
Is it all right?
It wasn't okay, but I think so you want me to talk how to elaborate a little bit on intersectionality and mentalization?
That's right, because attachment is obviously from dyadic to multi-attachment model. So then we know that mentalization and also intersectionality, they are also involving quite a few layers. So in those contexts, then how do we, for example, provide insight in understanding of attachment?
We need another workshop on that, but I think those two, what you just said, I think for me, that actually captures the field, because mentalization is about the ability to infer what the other person is thinking. intersectionality, which is intersecting factors of oppression, is about the society. Poverty, racism, discrimination, violence, trauma. Now, what we want in mentalization is to be able to think about the society. That's where we want. So mentalization is not just about thinking about what John is thinking, but about what is Turkey thinking when they do this, or what is Australia thinking. So I think mentalization and intersectionality is the perfect marriage of how we do our work. The question, how do we do it? Because intersectionality is like everything. For me, this concept of intersectionality shouldn't burden us. It should liberate us. So we shouldn't feel oppressed because oh my God, what am I going to do? It's similar to what Jaswant was saying. I think we have to take advocacy seriously as practitioners. And we have to have ethical practices and accountable practices. So Paul will talk a fair bit about accountability. But in narrative therapy, we will say, to be an ethical practitioner and to have a social justice framework is really important to do the work of intersectionality and mentalization. So I think it is not, it's not easy, but it's not something that my main plea is, we don't have to do this alone. We need a network of people. We need to find a way, what in narrative, Vicky Reynolds will say, imperfect allies. So we need a lot of allies, even if they are imperfect. And that's how we can capacity build each other.
Teşekkürler.
Last question from me, if you can, yes. Travma ve mentalizasyon ilişkisi çok ilgi çekici bir alan bence. Konuşmanızda şöyle bir şeyden bahsettiniz. Travmaya maruz kalan kişilerden bazılarının ebeveynlerinin zihninden geçenleri anlama, yani mentalize etme konusunda bir geri adım attıklarını ya da bunu yapmayı bıraktıklarını. Sorum şu olacak, yani çok erken dönemde ve kaçınamayacakları bir travmaya maruz kalan özellikle çocukların bu durumu nasıl mentalize ettiklerine ilişkin, ki bu bir ihtiyaç olsa gerek, yani yetişmekte olan bir çocuğun mentalize ederek dünyayı kavradıklarını eğer düşünürsek, anlam veremedikleri ve mentalize edemedikleri bir travmaya maruz kalan bir çocuğun bu durumla nasıl baş ettiğine ilişkin bir fikriniz var mı?
There is literature on that, because the mentalization research actually came out of infants who had trauma pre-verbally. So there is very clear research saying how the body encodes through activation, hyperarousal, and dissociation. So mentalization, even though it feels like it's a psychological thing, it's actually a body process as well. So of course it happens, even children pre-verbal capacities mentalize traumatic experiences.
Evet, bu güzel konuşma için çok teşekkür ediyoruz kendisine.